Yep. Yeah. There we go. Okay, so tonight's talk, Britain's Orchids, with a bit of a focus on London in particular, is by Michael Waller. He's going to give an introduction to himself as well, but just to say, to start off with, he's co-author of a really brilliant book, recent book on Britain's orchids. He's a very knowledgeable botanist. He's a member of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and he was project officer for the Lesser Butterfly Orchid Species Recovery Project in Devon and Cornwall. He's going to tell you a little bit more about himself when I hand over to him. So I'm going to stop my screen share and hand over to you, Michael.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Let's get this opened up. Right. Okay. Okay. Brilliant.
Perfect.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
great.
Is that good? That's all right, is it? Yeah.
That's lovely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm Mike or Michael, whichever. It's absolutely fine. Yeah. So just a bit on me. I've been absolutely fascinated with wild orchids for about 25 years now. Maybe a little bit less. Ever since I was a kid, obsessed with them. Looked through the wildflower guides, saw the orchids, and thought, right at the back. They're always at the back of the wildflower guides, and thought these look absolutely amazing. They're beautiful. They're rare, incredible. So I've been hooked ever since. But actually, I sort of started my conservation background. I still work in conservation in London. So I started at the Natural History Museum, working in the Angela Marmont Centre, which is where your library is. And yeah, working with Mark Spencer, you mentioned me, Mark Spencer and Fred Rumsey. So sort of started there and then worked for London Wildlife Trust for about 3.5 years. So it was quite steeped in London wildlife, urban wildlife, and the orchids that can be found in Greater London. And then since then, I've moved to Exeter, where still as an ecologist, but the reason we moved was so I could start a job with plant life, doing the Lesser Butterfly Orchid project, and now I'm working for an organisation called Environment Bank, but still very involved in orchids, and of course wrote the book as well. So yeah, great that you could be here, and we'll get started. So I thought the first question really is what is an orchid? Let's start from the top. So obviously an orchid is a type of wildflower. It's a grouping of wildflowers. So I thought I'd just run through some of the features that define orchids. So most people think of orchids, they think of these things, these big tropical, garish hothouse hybrids, kind of things, that you'd get in the exit of a Sainsbury's. These ones that grow in the tropics, that sort of thing. And of course they are orchids, but we've got our own orchids as well, maybe not quite as big and garish, but we do here in Britain, and there's quite a few of them. So one of the first things that makes orchids a little bit different maybe to quite a few other plants, one of the features is the way that they interact with fungi, with mycorrhizal fungi. So for orchids to be able to germinate, or most orchids to be able to germinate, they actually, in a way, it's a parasitization. They trap mycorrhizal fungi, hyphae, around the germinating seed. And through that system, they get nutrients basically to allow them to germinate. So that's quite a unique feature for them. And it means that they don't, like a lot of seeds which have to carry enormous amounts of proteins in their structure, it means that orchid seeds don't have to do that because they just rely on the fungi. And that means as a result that the seeds can be very, very, very small. Now, why is that advantageous? It's advantageous because if you've got a small dust-like seed, you can travel a long way on the wind. So they can be very good dispersers indeed, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. So they behave a little bit like a bulb, I suppose. They're perennial, which means that they flower in theory every year, although they can have a year off. But it does mean that they can be very, very long-lived. We know that some of our native species can live at least 100 years. But the way that it works is they have a tuber, and that tuber feeds the growing plant through the year until it flowers. And then at the same time, a new tuber is formed, and that will go on to support the plant when it grows the following year and returns to flowering. They have some of the other features is that they have leaves which come directly out of the stem, so they don't have stalked leaves. The veins, the venation of the leaves is also parallel, so there's no net veins. You'll always just get straight parallel veins along the length of the leaf. And they also produce what's called an inflorescence. So they have this, generally a spike of multiple flowers in this spike, although some of our species can have just the one flower, like lady slipper. Generally, they have this spike of flowers. Now, one of the other features that separates them from other groups of wildflowers in the monocot group, so they're monocots like grasses, orchids, so they produce one leaf when they germinate. But what separates them from, say, lilies, so that's lily on the right there, is that one of the petals is highly modified. So this orchid on the left here is called a sawfly orchid, and actually you can see we've got the 3 sepals behind at the back of the flower, and then 2 very small, difficult to see here, but 2 very small triangular upper petals, and then that whole bit at the bottom, which has evolved to look a lot like a type of sawfly, is actually just a single petal. So that's one of the features. They've got this very highly modified lower petal, which is called the labellum or the lip. So which orchids do we have in Britain and Ireland? Well, just to put it into a little bit of context, in the world, there are about 26 to 28,000 species of wild orchids in 880 genera. So that means that they are one of the most successful wildflower groups. They're just behind Asteraceae, which is the daisy family, for the most number of species. So they're very successful. They're all over the world and they're doing very well. But in the UK and Ireland, unfortunately, we only have 56. So slightly smaller percentage than we only have a small percentage of the world total, but was not doing too badly. And those are split into 21 genera in total. So I thought I'd just touch on a couple of genera, 2 of the big genera that we've got in the British Isles and in Ireland. The first one is Dactylorhiza. So that's the Latin name for this group. It's basically the marsh orchids and the spotted orchids. They tend to like to grow in quite damp places, and they're temperate species. They're usually quite sort of purplish, slightly reddish colour, in that sort of range. And the reason for that is they're generally pollinated by bees. So we've got 7 species of marsh and spotted orchids in the UK. Now, one of the main features about these is that there's the 7 species for you. One of the main features about the Dactylorhiza group, which causes a lot of issues for people, is that they love to hybridize. They're rampant, they're very promiscuous indeed, and they will hybridize whenever they're together, which is interesting. So it's only the common spotted orchid in this group and the early marsh orchid, which have evolved through natural selection. The other species are actually all of hybrid origin, stabilized hybrids, which have speciated through the result of various hybridization events within the last 10,000 years. So quite a few of these species are actually quite new. In geological terms, they're very, very new species. But when they're together, they will hybridize. Some of you may have seen this if you've gone to a big marsh orchid colony. You'll see lots of different forms if you get common spotted and southern marsh orchid together, which often do occur in London together. They will hybridize and you'll get all these different forms, making identification very confusing indeed. So they are a bit of a head scratcher. Now, the other group, the other genera, is the Epipactis. These are sort of informally called the Helleborines, although there is another genera that they're called Helleborines, but these are the Helleborines. These flower a little bit later on in the year. They're generally associated with woodland, although a couple of species aren't necessarily always associated with woodland. And they are, so there's got 7 species of the Epipactis as well, mostly quite greenish actually in colour, apart from dark red helleborine, which is a bit of a deeper red colour. That one's found up north. But the interesting thing about these is these are pollinated by the common wasp. So this is why they flower a little bit later, to coincide with the emergence of wasps. So actually the lip is, if I could just go back a little bit, the lip is, as you can see, highly modified. That lower petal is split into 2 compartments. The upper compartment is a cup-like structure, and within that is a sticky viscous fluid, which is a bit like jam, and wasps absolutely love it. So they'll come down and try and get hold of that. But unfortunately, it's full of compounds, which actually has a sort of effect on them, which is a bit like them being drunk. So later on in the season, if you ever come across a broadleaf helleborine, which is one of the more common ones that you can find in London, you'll often find wasps clambering around the flowers, struggling to hold on, sometimes just flailing around on the floor underneath. It's unclear why the plant produces these compounds, but it's certainly an interesting effect. So where do orchids grow? Where can we find them? Well, as I say, in the tropics, they're generally found high up on the boughs of trees. So if you ever been to the tropics, you often need binoculars to see them. Fortunately, here in Britain and Ireland, you don't need binoculars unless you're looking across a field and you don't want to trespass, which we don't want to trespass. I wouldn't recommend it. But they're terrestrial, so they grow on the ground. So, they'll grow in grasslands like these early purple orchids, growing in open grassland in South Devon. But they'll also grow in woodland as well. They can do this. So, for instance, this bird's nest orchid can grow in deep, dark woodland as a result of the fact that it has this association with fungi. So it doesn't even need to photosynthesize. It gathers all its energy from its fungal, well, I wanted to say fungal partner. It's actually more of a parasitization, but from the fungus that it's parasitizing. So they can take advantage of these very dark woodland habitats. You'll also find them in bogs. So we've got some tiny bog orchids here in a mountain flush, very acidic peat bog where not many of the plants can grow in mid Wales. And they'll also grow through cracks in pavements, these dark red helleborines growing on some limestone pavement, making the most of that habitat. And orchids do seem to love to grow on road verges as well. So they're quite happy. Some species are quite happy in the urban environment. And again, we'll touch on that in a moment, particularly with reference to London. So we've actually got a really good range of orchids. We might not have a huge number of species compared to some other countries, but we've got a really good range of species. So the reason for this is we've got a very diverse geology. We've also got a massive latitudinal range, and we've got mountains and lower reaches as well. So there's sort of a good altitudinal and latitudinal range and lots of different geologies as well, which means that we're able to support a variety of different orchids from different climatic regions. So for instance, on the left here, we've got the early spider orchid, which is found only in southern England at the moment. So that's the species which is on the edge of its range in Britain. It's more associated with a warm Mediterranean climate. So if you ever go to Italy, about now actually, if you go to Italy or Mediterranean country now, you'll see loads of these everywhere, but they're on the edge of their range. Then we have things like the violet helleborine in the middle. They're more temperate Central European species, very happy in the UK generally. Found in the Midlands until the sort of northern edges of northern England. But then on the far right, we've got things like the coral root orchid. Now, these are more subarctic species. If you go to Europe, you'll only find them in the higher mountains. And so as a result, they're restricted to Scotland. They do range down into Cumbria and parts of Yorkshire as well. But basically, they're also on the edge of their range in Britain. So if you go up into Norway, you'll see them growing out in the open. They're fairly common there. So we've got a range of sort of all the way from Mediterranean species in the south, right up until subarctic boreal species in the north. So it's quite an interesting range. Actually, this is a really good case in point. So this is the Burren in Western Ireland, region of County Clare, big limestone region. And you can see just in the foreground, I've circled it here, we've got a dense flowered orchid. So dense flowered orchid is a Mediterranean species. You go to Cyprus, they're everywhere, really, really common. But they just about make it into Ireland, which is interesting because they grow alongside an Arctic alpine species. So just growing all around there in the turf is Dryas octopetala, mountain avens, which is an Arctic alpine species. So here we've got a Mediterranean species growing directly alongside an Arctic alpine in this completely unique setting. Could really only happen in Britain and Ireland. But what about London? Well, surprisingly, Greater London, we're talking about Greater London as is from 1965, has a lot of different habitats, and it does host lots of orchids. So as of the last couple of years, we now have a total of 20 species in London, which is quite surprising, I think, for a lot of people to realise 20 species of orchids growing, as I say, in a variety of different places. Most species down in the south, on where the North Downs creeps into South London. But they're scattered around, some species more common than others. Some of these are very rare indeed. But they do grow in a variety of different places. So here's one of the prime orchid habitats. Carnaby Street. A little bit unsuspecting, but there are orchids in Carnaby Street. I mean, I was surprised by this as well, but this was something which I was excited by just before I left London to move down to Devon. But at number 36, up on the roof, there is an orchid. Now, this orchid was just happened to be mentioned to me when I was doing a big survey for the Wild West End project, and I was working for London Wildlife Trust. And the building manager said, "Oh, I think we've had an orchid on our roof." And I said, "Really?" And he sent me a picture, a really bad picture. And so I went back the following year, and sure enough, there are orchids growing on green roofs overlooking Carnaby Street. So even right in the middle of the city, we've got orchids growing. And it isn't just Carnaby Street. They're also growing on the green roof of Namura International in the City of London as well. So here I am, gleefully pointing at a green-winged orchid with the ecologist who manages the roof there. And it turns out they're also elsewhere in Islington. Now, I will warn you, the next picture is not as nice of me. I don't know what I was doing. It's difficult to smile when a picture's being taken on demand. But there we go. I've tried my best. I was trying to look stoic. I learnt my lesson. So there was also a green-winged orchid, which was picked up by the media, growing up on this green roof in Islington as well. So there I am with Dusty Gedge, Mr. Green Roof, and an MP who's no longer an MP, who's been in the news recently for various reasons. So they, orchids have this, so the point is orchids have this capacity to be able to spread really long distances and turn up in places where you wouldn't expect. So yes, this is the green-winged orchid, as I've already alluded to, a species which is usually associated with herb-rich, species-rich lowland meadows, traditionally managed meadows, but actually turns out in the urban environment, it can be quite a weedy species. Generally in London, this is a rare species. There used to be significant colonies, particularly in Morden Cemetery, which has gradually disappeared. I don't think occurs there anymore. And apart from that, they're really just scattered about. And now the majority of plants seem to be just turning up on green roofs right in the middle of the city, which is amazing. But it was on this very same green roof on Namura International that 2 years after I left London, this species turned up, which was even more remarkable. So I think Mark had been managing it very well, but this is a species which is extremely rare in the UK and has only ever been recorded previous to this once, and where a small colony used to grow on the Rhine Peninsula, just over the border into Cornwall from Devon, flowered through to the mid-2000s and then gradually disappeared and was extinct. And then suddenly 20 plants turned up on the green roof of the investment bank in the City of London. Absolutely amazing. No idea how they've got there, whether they've blown over from France. We'll never know, whether they're already in the turf. But again, another incredible success story that now the main colony for the species is found on a green roof in the middle of London. Here's another London speciality. This is maybe London's smallest nature reserve. Some of you will already be aware of this plant, and I'm sure the orchids I've just talked about, but this is a lizard orchid, which was first found, I think, around 2010. It's in Isleworth. It used to be just by a bus stop on a bit of waste ground, but it just so happened that shortly after it was found, I think it was blocks of flats surrounding the plant were redeveloped. So I think Mark Spencer and myself at a separate occasion went and spoke to the building manager whilst they were building this building and said, "You need to protect this plant." When I went back the following year after they'd finished the building, this is what I found, which is quite a sorry sight. This is what they've done is they've kept the plant, but all around that you can't see under the bark chip is actually weed matting. So they cut a hole in the weed matting to allow the orchid to flower through. I don't know if this plant is still there. This photograph, I think it's from 2018, but an absolutely amazing thing, even if it is quite sad. I mean, they could have at least left the grassland, couldn't they? But there you go. So this is the lizard orchid, again, a sort of warm Mediterranean species, very common in parts of Kent. And it's one of the ones that we're probably going to be expecting to see more of. In the last few years, this species has been turning up all over the place in southern England and is a really weedy one and seems to have a particular propensity to be able to just pop up out of nowhere. But yes, London does have a long history with orchids, going as far back as Charles Darwin, of course, at Down House, which is within Greater London. It's still a fantastic site for orchids, with his publication of the various contrivances by which orchids are fertilized by insects, published in 1862. That came at a time where orchid mania was its absolute peak, Victorian England, where rich people would be paying enormous amounts of money to get their hands on some of the rarest orchids at the edges of the empire. And as a result, there became a serious obsession with them. And actually that did extend to our native species as well, and has continued to. So there is still an ongoing threat for our native orchids, is collecting, although I think in a lot of cases it's possibly overblown. There have been cases of orchids being dug up, but actually the bigger threat, much bigger threat, is fragmentation and lack of management. So this, again, a slightly sorry site, depending on how you look at it, in West Wales. This is a roadside nature reserve created purely for one early purple orchid just outside Aberystwyth. But it tells a story, doesn't it, that a lot of our orchids are now pushed, a lot of our wild plants and wildlife are pushed into these small strips of marginal habitat, often along road verges, because they are managed, they're still cut, because they're still managed as wild habitats, which is actually quite advantageous for orchids because they don't compete very well with other vegetation. So the real threat is the lack of management and this fragmentation of habitat, which makes it much harder for orchids and other wild plants to get around. And that's something we really need to work on to improve our chances for our wild orchids. But here's a good example of what can be done. This is, believe it or not, the middle of a council estate, not far from where I'm from in Wolverhampton. It used to just be a playing field, but an enlightened friend of mine, a professor at Wolverhampton University, started going around the Midlands and actually finding sites where he could strip back the topsoil, introduce green hay from Donor Meadows out in Worcestershire, introduce the green hay, and look at the results. We've got these thousands of green-winged orchids. So they can be quite picky orchids, but they don't have to be, and we can create these new habitats in the right places with relative ease if there is the willpower to do so. But there is one orchid that exemplifies rarity more than any other. And this is the only species of British and Irish orchid I've yet to see. And there's a whole generation of people who've grown up that have never seen it. And I'm sure there's people on this call who have seen it, and I'm very jealous of you. This is the ghost orchid. So it's only ever been recorded about 50 times, only in England. And this one, I think, from 1979 in Oxfordshire, is an interesting tale in conservation and how orchids can reappear from the dead. So here's some fantastic pictures, actually, of ghost orchids being photographed back in the day. So it's always been a rare species, as I say, but here's some photos of people photographing them in their former haunts in Buckinghamshire and the Chilterns, and the far right picture when a plant was found in 1982 by accident in a cart rut in Herefordshire, where it then flowered again quite a few years later. But it's interesting because I think it was towards the end of 2009, Plant Life put out the Ghost Orchid Declaration, the foreword of which was written and signed by King Charles, then Prince Charles, so using the ghost orchid as this emblematic species of plant conservation that we can't lose any more wild plants, not like the ghost orchid. And of course, what happened 1 week later? The ghost orchid was refound after 23 years in that very same cart track in Herefordshire, showing that these things are very long-lived and can reappear after a long period of time. So that ghost orchid, it flowered in 1982, it flowered again in 2009, one little wildflower. So these things can reappear, although the ghost orchid, I'm not sure, maybe it won't. I really hope it does. So in terms of why I'm here, of course, it's co-author of Britain's Orchids. So this is our new, I say new, it's not new actually, we published it in September 2020. So if you do have an interest in wild orchids, then I'd highly recommend picking up a copy. It's published with Princeton Press. You can get it from NHBS. I'd recommend get it from NHBS or from Princeton directly. And just a little bit on the book itself. Obviously, it covers all our British and Irish species, but one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was being able to show people how to identify orchids when they're not actually in flower. So most orchids actually produce, so just looking at the image on the right there, most orchids produce what's called a rosette. It's a circular arrangement of leaves which are quite flat to the ground. You can actually identify orchids when they're in this state. There are identification features just as easy to tell as when they're in flower. So that was something I really wanted to focus on, following on from work I did at the Natural History Museum. But also looking at orchids when they're in bud, because they are quite distinctive as well. So really getting people to understand the sort of vegetative, as they call the vegetative features, to be able to pick these things up. And actually some of our orchids, because they are of Mediterranean origin, they're evolved more for warm climates, they don't disappear underground during the winter. So they produce leaves in autumn, and they'll sit above ground with their leaves out throughout the winter. So for instance, one of our more common species, the bee orchid, you can go hunting for bee orchid at Christmas and you'll see them sat in the grass there, and you can identify them as bee orchid, so you don't need to wait for flowering time. So orchid hunting can continue throughout the entire season, which is always good. We also wanted to focus on hybrids as well. I touched on hybrids a little bit earlier on. So many of our orchids do hybridize, and you do get hybrids between different genera as well. So I said these marsh orchids can be very tricky. So we've gone into quite a bit of depth on that. It's quite technical, but hopefully that's useful as well. So we've tried to create a book which is as comprehensive as it possibly could be. So just in terms of, if you are in London, I'm aware that not everybody listening this evening will be based in London, but I assume quite a few will be. If you do want to go looking for orchids in London, this is a great site. I'm sure many of you are already aware of the London Wetland Centre, fantastic for birds, but great for orchids too. There's bee orchids around a lot of the tracks, so I'd recommend going there in early June. You'll also see lots of southern marsh orchids as well, a few common spotted. If you look really hard, I think there's some broadleaf tenebrines in the more wooded zones as well, but best to just ask at the visitor centre and they can point you in the right direction, but they are nice and easy to find. But in terms of the best area of London to go and look for orchids, as I alluded to earlier, the North Downs, which is a big area of sort of a chalky area. Most orchids prefer more alkaline soil, more chalky limestone soils. You need to go to South London for that, and there's lots of great reserves that you can go to and you can see orchids. So one of our former sites when I was working for London Wildlife Trust, Hutchinson's Bank and Chapel Bank, you can see quite a few species there, including quite scarce man orchid, which is a lovely one. Downbank, which is of course Darwin's former haunt, now managed by Kent Wildlife Trust, has absolutely loads of orchids. Fly orchid, a few other rarities as well. Same with High Elms Country Park too. So definitely get down there, and you can find information online, or I can happily give you some information. You can go and look for them yourself. As I say, early June, late May, good time to go and look for them. So thank you very much. And one thing actually I just wanted to say, if you wanted to, if you're interested in going on orchid tours, myself and my co-author who wrote the book, Sean, we actually we're running a couple of orchid tours next season. It's fully booked for this year, but we're going to Northwest Ireland in May, but we're also going to the Cotswolds as well, just a weekend trip where you can learn more about orchids and find lots of lovely species. So have a look on the Greenwings website. You'll find lots of information there. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting and great introduction. It was particularly nice to see some of the amazing orchids that have been found in London. The poor lizard orchid with the tape around it, as you say. I hope it kind of managed to survive, and I guess at least they were trying to kind of preserve it, but I'm sure it could have been done slightly in a kind of more tasteful sort of way. But anyway,
I suspect there might be people on the call who know the fate of that lizard orchid better than me, so we'll find out.
Yeah.